Most people think of one machine when they hear about World War II codes. The Enigma. Its story is famous. But the secret war of words was much bigger than a single machine. It was a global conflict fought by mathematicians, linguists, and engineers. They worked in quiet rooms far from any battlefield. Their weapons were pencils, paper, and buzzing machines. Thousands of men and women spent their days and nights trying to read the enemy's mind. And they tried to keep their own thoughts secret. What if the most effective code wasn't a machine at all, but a language spoken by just a few hundred people on Earth? What if a message's security depended on a cheap, pocket-sized piece of cardboard? The war of information was filled with dozens of systems. Some were brilliant feats of engineering, others were simple tricks. Each one held the lives of soldiers, sailors, and civilians in its delicate web of letters and numbers. This was a shadow war where a single broken message could change the course of history. But what about all the other codes? The ones that don't have movies made about them? What secrets did they protect, and how were they broken? Number 18. What if a code was so complex, it needed a machine to think? The Lorenz cipher was not like other systems. It was used for the highest level messages. Think communications between top generals and their central command. It was a teleprinter cipher. This means it didn't use Morse code. Instead, it directly encrypted the text that would be typed out by a machine at the other end. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, the famous code-breaking center, called the machine Tunny. The machine itself was a monster. It was far more complex than the more famous Enigma. It had a series of 12 wheels, which was a huge leap from the 3 or 4 on a standard army Enigma. These wheels didn't work in a simple, predictable way. They worked in 2 groups. One group of 5 wheels, called the chi wheels, would spin with each letter typed. Another group of 5, the C wheels, spun in a more irregular way, and 2 motor wheels controlled the C wheels. This created a level of complexity that was staggering. The number of possible starting positions was not in the millions or billions. It was a number so large it had more than 500 digits. Breaking into this system seemed impossible, but the codebreakers got a lucky break. On August 30th, 1941, a German operator in Athens needed to resend a long message. The message was nearly 4,000 characters long. He made a critical mistake. He used the exact same key setting for the new message, but he typed it slightly differently, using abbreviations like Sprucknummer instead of Spruckner. This tiny difference was everything. A listening station in Britain picked up both garbled messages. A brilliant cryptanalyst named John Tiltman studied the 2 nearly identical streams of nonsense. He realized they were the same message encrypted with the same key. From this, he could work backward to find the original plain text, and more importantly, the obscuring key sequence generated by the machine. This key sequence was the key to everything. Another analyst, a young chemistry graduate named Bill Tutt, was given this long key sequence. He spent months studying it on paper. He wasn't trying to build the machine. He was trying to understand its logic. In early 1942, Tutt figured out the structure of the Tunny machine. He did it without ever having seen one. It was a stunning achievement of pure deduction. Knowing the structure was one thing, breaking messages daily was another. The calculations were too long and complex to do by hand. This is where another key figure comes in, a post office engineer named Tommy Flowers. He was convinced he could build a machine to do the work. His idea was considered radical. He wanted to use vacuum tubes, thousands of them. Most people thought a machine with so many tubes would constantly break down, but Flowers persisted. The result was Colossus, the world's first large-scale electronic digital computer. Colossus Mark I was operational by December 1943. It could read the encrypted tape at 5,000 characters per second and perform the calculations needed to find the wheel settings of the Lorenz machine. It turned a process that took weeks into one that took hours. The intelligence gained from these fish decrypts, as they were called, was called Ultra. It gave the Allies a direct look into the strategic thinking of the enemy's highest command. What do we still not know about the Lorenz system? How many high-level strategic decisions were directly altered because of the intelligence from Tunny decrypts? Were there other, even more complex cipher machines developed that the Allies never even discovered? What happened to the technical blueprints and design documents for Lorenz that were likely destroyed at the end of the conflict? Number 17, could an ancient language be the most modern weapon? In the early days of the war in the Pacific, the Japanese military had a distinct advantage. They were exceptionally good at breaking American codes. They also had teams of English-speaking soldiers who could listen to radio chatter and understand orders, positions, and plans. The United States Marine Corps needed a way to communicate that was fast, accurate, and completely secure. The answer came from a man who was not a soldier or a cryptographer. His name was Philip Johnston. Johnston was the son of a missionary who grew up on the Navajo Nation reservation. He was one of a handful of non-Navajo people who could speak their language fluently. He knew the language was incredibly complex. Its grammar and syntax were unlike anything in European or Asian languages. It was also an unwritten language at the time. There were no books or dictionaries for an enemy to study. In 1942, Johnston presented his idea to the Marine Corps. He proposed using the Navajo language as a battlefield code. At first, they were skeptical, but they agreed to a demonstration. 2 Navajo speakers were placed in separate rooms. They were given a standard military message. They transmitted it, received it, and translated it in seconds. A standard encryption machine at the time would have taken 30 minutes. The Marines were sold. They started with an initial group of 29 Navajo recruits. These men became known as the Navajo Code Talkers. Their first task was to create the code itself. It wasn't just about speaking Navajo over the radio. They developed a 2-part system. First, they created a dictionary of Navajo words for common military terms. A submarine became Besh Lo, which means iron fish. A battleship was Lo So, or whale. A dive bomber was guinea, or chicken hawk. This made communication incredibly fast. But what about words that weren't in their dictionary, like a person's name or a specific map grid? For this, they created a phonetic alphabet. They assigned a Navajo word to each letter of the English alphabet. For the letter A, they could use the word wol la chi, which means aunt. For B, they used shush, which means bear. To spell the word navy, a code talker would say sa'azi wol la chi ake diglini sa. This meant needle, ant, victor, yucca. To an outsider listening in, it was just a stream of unrelated words in a language they couldn't possibly understand. The code was a massive success. It was used in every major Marine operation in the Pacific from 1942 to 1945. During the battle for Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo Code Talkers worked around the clock for 2 days. They sent and received over 800 messages without a single error. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signal officer, said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." The code was never broken by the enemy. It was so secure that its existence remained a classified secret until 1968. The original 29 were followed by over 400 more Navajos who served as code talkers. Their unique cultural heritage became a vital military asset. There are still so many unanswered questions. How many other indigenous languages were considered or even informally tested for similar programs? Did any field units create their own unofficial code talker programs that were never documented? What psychological toll did it take on these young men to carry such a vital national secret, unable to speak of their service for over 2 decades? Number 16. Did the Americans build a better Enigma that never got cracked? The American military knew it needed a top-tier encryption system. They had seen the rise of machine ciphers in Europe. The U.S. Army's leading cryptanalyst, William Friedman, was tasked with creating one. The result of his team's work was the SIGABA. It was an electromechanical rotor cipher machine, similar in principle to the German Enigma, but it had a crucial difference that made it exponentially more secure. The SIGABA, also known as the ECM Mark II, was a beast of a machine. It looked like a heavy typewriter with a complex array of rotors at the back. Like Enigma, it used rotors to scramble the letters of a message, but the genius of SIGABA was in how those rotors moved. In a German Enigma, the rotors turned in a predictable odometer-like fashion. After a certain number of key presses, one rotor would click the next one over. A skilled cryptanalyst could eventually figure out that pattern. Friedman knew this was a weakness. The SIGABA solved this problem with a clever new design. The machine had 3 banks of 5 rotors each. One bank was the main ciphering bank, which did the actual encryption. Another bank was the control bank, and a third was the index bank. The way it worked was that the control rotors would process the typed letter first. Based on their internal wiring, they would send an electrical signal to the main ciphering rotors, telling a specific, seemingly random combination of them to turn. This meant the movement of the main rotors was not regular. It was different with almost every single keystroke. This destroyed the predictable pattern that codebreakers relied on. It created a level of cryptographic security that was unmatched by any other portable machine in the war. Development of the machine began in the 1930s. Friedman and his colleague Frank Rowlett created the core design. The U.S. Navy also had a similar project, and the two eventually, merged their efforts. By 1941, the machine was in production. It became the primary encryption system for high-level American communications for the rest of the war. It was so secure that the United States felt confident sharing it with their British allies. The British version was called the Combined Cipher Machine, or CCM. This allowed the two allies to communicate at the highest levels with complete security. Throughout the war, there is no evidence that any Axis power ever successfully broke a message encrypted with SIGABA. It protected troop movements, strategic plans, and sensitive diplomatic traffic. While Bletchley Park was famously reading German Enigma messages, the Axis cryptanalysts were staring at a wall of gibberish from the SIGABA. The machine's complexity and the genius of its irregular rotor movement kept its secrets safe for the entire conflict. It was, in essence, the unbreakable Enigma. But what don't we know? What specific vulnerabilities, if any, did internal security reviews of SIGABA find during the war years? Did any Axis cryptanalysts ever get close to a breakthrough only to have their research abandoned or destroyed? How many SIGABA machines were lost in combat or at sea, and what were the exact protocols to prevent them from falling into enemy hands? Number 15. How could a diplomatic code become an open book? The Japanese government needed a way to send secure messages to its embassies around the world. In the late 1930s, they developed a new cipher machine for this purpose. It was a sophisticated device that used a series of telephone stepping switches to create a complex polyalphabetic substitution cipher. The Americans, who had been monitoring Japanese diplomatic traffic, gave the machine the codename Purple. They didn't have the machine itself, just the garbled messages it produced. The task of breaking Purple fell to the U.S. Army Signals Intelligence Service, SIS. The team was led by the brilliant William Friedman. This was a different challenge than other codes. It wasn't a military code used for battlefield tactics. It was a diplomatic code carrying information about negotiations, political intentions, and intelligence reports from ambassadors. Breaking, it would provide a priceless window into the Japanese government's thinking. The work was slow and frustrating. The team had no clues about how the machine worked. All they had were the encrypted messages. They began with statistical analysis, looking for patterns in the letters. They noticed that some parts of the message seemed to be encrypted with a simple system, while others were much more complex. Friedman had a breakthrough when he realized the machine likely separated the vowels from the consonants and encrypted them using different systems. He theorized that the machine used a system similar to telephone switches, which could be wired in thousands of different ways. For 20 months, the SIS team worked tirelessly. They used pencils, paper, and their own intellect to reverse engineer the machine's logic. Leo Rosen of the SIS was instrumental in building the hardware that would replicate the Japanese machine. In August 1940, they succeeded. They had built a machine that could decrypt Purple messages. They didn't steal a machine or capture a code book. They created their own from scratch, based purely on cryptanalysis of the encrypted traffic. It was an astonishing achievement. The intelligence from the Purple decrypts was codenamed Magic. It gave American leaders, including the president, an unprecedented view into Japanese diplomacy. They could read the instructions being sent to the Japanese ambassador in Washington, D.C. during the tense negotiations in 1941. They learned about Japanese intentions in Southeast Asia and their assessments of the European powers. The information from Magic was a critical source of intelligence throughout the entire war, helping to shape American strategy in the Pacific. The Japanese government trusted their purple machine so much that they continued to use it for the entire war, never realizing the Americans were reading their most secret cables. What are the lingering mysteries? What specific diplomatic opportunities were missed or capitalized on because of the magic intelligence? How did the small team at SIS keep their monumental breakthrough a secret, even from other parts of the American government? Were there any other diplomatic cipher machines from other nations during that period that were broken but whose stories have never been told? Number 14. Could you hide a secret in a simple poem? Not all codes were machines. Some of the most personal and dangerous codes were created by individuals working under extreme pressure. This was the world of agents and spies. The British Special Operations Executive SOE was responsible for sending agents into occupied territories to work with resistance movements. These agents needed a way to send and receive messages that was both secure and personal. Their lives depended on it. Leo Marx was the head of codes and ciphers for the SOE. He was a young genius, barely in his 20s, but he had a deep understanding of cryptography. When he arrived at SOE, he was horrified by the state of their codes. They were using ciphers that were based on well-known poems like ones by Shakespeare. The idea was that an agent would use a line from a poem as their key. The problem, Marx realized, was that an enemy cryptanalyst could easily try all the famous poems in the world until they found the right one. It was a system just waiting to fail. Marx decided the SOE needed a better way. He believed the best keys were original poems written specifically for that purpose. They would be unique, memorable, and unknown to anyone else. So he started writing them. He wrote hundreds of short, often poignant poems that were given to agents before they were sent into the field. An agent would memorize the poem. This poem was their key. The system he implemented was a one-time pad system, but with a twist. The key was the poem. To encrypt the message, an agent would use a double transposition cipher, a complex method of writing the message into a grid and then rearranging the columns and rows based on keywords from their poem. It was difficult to do by hand, under stress, but it was very secure if done correctly. The most famous poem Marx wrote was for an agent named Violette Sabo. It began with the lines, "The life that I have is all that I have, and the life that I have is yours." The poem was not just a key, it was a personal connection, a piece of humanity in a cold, mathematical world. Marx also revolutionized the security checks agents used. He invented the idea of a prearranged error in the message. An agent would be told to deliberately misspell the 16th word, for example. If a message came in without that specific mistake, Marx knew the agent had been captured and was being forced to send messages by the enemy. This simple trick saved countless lives and prevented a great deal of misinformation from being trusted. Leo Marx's work showed that cryptography could be deeply personal. It wasn't just about machines and algorithms. It was about human memory, creativity, and trust. What parts of this story are still in the shadows? How many agents were lost because they made a small mistake in their poem-based encryption under extreme duress? Did any enemy codebreakers ever manage to reconstruct one of Marx's original poems from captured messages? What happened to the hundreds of other poems he wrote that were never used or whose recipients did not return? And number 13. What if the key to the entire Pacific War was a 5-digit number? The Japanese Imperial Navy's main operational code was a complex system. The Americans called JN-25. It wasn't a machine cipher. It was a codebook system, but a very sophisticated one. It was the code used to direct ship movements, plan operations, and report on engagements or breaking. It was the top priority for American cryptanalysts in the Pacific. The main code-breaking effort was centered at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The JN-25 system had two parts. First, there was a codebook containing tens of thousands of 5-digit numbers. Each number represented a word, a phrase, or a specific location. So a message would be converted into a long string of these 5-digit groups. But the Japanese knew that if the Allies captured a codebook, the system would be useless. So they added a second layer of security. They used a second book called the additive book, which was filled with thousands of random 5-digit numbers. To encrypt a message, a Japanese code clerk would take the code group from the first book and add a number from the additive book to it without carrying over to create the final encrypted group. To decrypt, you had to subtract the same additive number. The challenge for the Americans was immense. They had to rebuild both the codebook and the additive book from scratch just by analyzing intercepted radio traffic. The team at Station Hypo, led by the unconventional but brilliant commander Joseph Rochefort, worked relentlessly. They were a motley crew of linguists, mathematicians, and even musicians from the ship's band who had a good ear for patterns. They called their work the traffic analysis. They listened to thousands of messages, noting where they came from, where they were going, and how often certain number groups appeared. By early 1942, they had made significant progress. They had recovered thousands of code groups and additives. They couldn't read every message perfectly, but they could get the gist of many of them. Their big test came in the spring of 1942. They started seeing frequent references to an objective designated AF. Rochefort's team believed AF was Midway Island, but leaders in Washington were skeptical. They thought it could be a target in the South Pacific or even the west coast of the U.S. To confirm their theory, Rochefort and his team devised a clever trap. They used a secure undersea cable to tell the American base on Midway to send out an unencrypted radio message saying they were running low on fresh water. A few days later, a Japanese listening station sent a message back to Japan using JN-25. The American codebreakers intercepted it. The decrypted message read that AF was short of fresh water. Rochefort had his proof. The Japanese were planning to attack Midway. Armed with this information, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was able to position his aircraft carriers to ambush the Japanese fleet. The resulting Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a decisive victory for the United States. It is widely considered the turning point of the war in the Pacific. This victory was made possible by the quiet, painstaking work of the codebreakers at Station Hypo, who had managed to read the enemy's mail. But what remains unknown about JN-25, how close did the Japanese Navy come to realizing their code had been compromised before the Battle of Midway? Were there other similar deception plans used by the Allies to confirm codebook entries that have never been declassified? What other major naval operations, both Allied and Japanese, were fundamentally shaped by intelligence gleaned from JN-25 decrypts that are less famous than Midway? Number 12, could a simple grid of letters fool an entire army? Not all ciphers needed complex machines or thick codebooks. Sometimes, a simple system used with discipline could be very effective. One of the classic ciphers that saw use during the Second World War was the Playfair cipher. It was invented by an Englishman named Charles Wheatstone in 1854, but was promoted by his friend Lord Playfair, whose name stuck. It was a manual cipher done with pencil and paper. It was considered a good field cipher because it was relatively fast to use and didn't require any special equipment. The Playfair cipher is based on a 5x5 grid of letters. The grid is filled with a keyword, with repeated letters omitted, followed by the rest of the alphabet. The letters I and J are usually combined in one square to make everything fit. For example, if the keyword is cryptography, the grid would start with CRYPTOGAH and then be filled with the remaining letters of the alphabet. To encrypt a message, you first break the plaintext into pairs of letters. If there's a double letter, like ILL in balloon, you insert an % between them, so it becomes Balex low on. Then you find the two letters of a pair in the grid. The encryption rule depends on their position. If the letters are in the same row, you replace them with the letters to their immediate right. If they are in the same column, you replace them with the letters immediately below them. If they're in different rows and columns, they form a rectangle. You replace them with the letters at the other two corners of the rectangle. This system was used by British forces in the Second World War. It was a step up from simpler substitution ciphers because it encrypted pairs of letters instead of single letters. This made it much harder to break using simple frequency analysis, the classic tool of codebreakers, which relies on counting how often each letter appears. In English, E is the most common letter. In a Playfair cipher, E could be encrypted as many different letters, and many different letters could be encrypted as E depending on the letter it was paired with. However, the Playfair cipher was not unbreakable. it had known weaknesses. Because it worked on pairs of letters, a cryptanalyst could analyze the frequency of letter pairs or digrams. Certain patterns in the ciphertext could also give clues about the positions of letters in the key square. The Australian Army also used the Playfair cipher during the war. There are documented cases of them using it for communication in the campaigns in New Guinea. While not suitable for high-level strategic messages, it was a practical and reasonably secure method for short-term tactical communications on the front lines, where speed was more important than absolute security. What questions about the Playfair cipher's use still linger? How many different keywords were in use by Allied units at any given time? And how were these keys distributed securely? Are there any documented cases of Axis forces successfully breaking Playfair messages and using that information to their advantage in a specific battle? Did soldiers in the field invent their own variations of the Playfair rules to increase security, creating ad hoc systems that were never officially recorded? Number 11. How do you hide a message in plain sight? Sometimes the best way to hide something is not to scramble it, but to make it invisible. This was the world of steganography, the art of concealed writing. During the war, this often meant invisible ink. The concept was ancient, but the chemical techniques became much more advanced. The spies and resistance fighters needed ways to send information on seemingly innocent letters or postcards. A normal letter could be intercepted, but if the real message was hidden between the lines, it might get through. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, was a major user of invisible ink technology. They developed several sophisticated formulas. One of the most famous involved a chemical called aminophenylacetic acid. When a message was written with this, it was completely invisible. To make it appear, the recipient would need to paint the paper with another chemical, sodium nitrite, and then expose it to ammonia fumes. This would cause the secret writing to appear in a reddish-brown color. This was a significant step up from the old high school trick of using lemon juice, which could be revealed just by heating the paper. The Allies were, of course, working hard to detect these hidden messages. Every piece of mail coming from neutral countries like Portugal and Spain was subject to censorship and inspection. At censorship stations in places like Bermuda and Trinidad, where mail was often routed, teams of examiners worked to find these secret communications. They had laboratories set up with a wide array of tools. They would steam open envelopes and examine the contents. They used ultraviolet lamps, which could cause some invisible inks to fluoresce. They would also expose papers to iodine vapor, which would stain the paper and reveal writing where the fibers had been disturbed by a pen. A major breakthrough in detecting these inks came from a discovery that many of the German inks were based on organic compounds. This meant they could be developed by reacting them with other chemicals. The Allied examiners developed a series of chemical tests they could apply to suspect letters. One of the most effective was the moist heat iodine test, where a piece of paper was exposed to a combination of humidity, heat, and iodine vapor, which could reveal a wide range of secret inks. The battle between the ink makers and the ink finders was a constant cat and mouse game. As soon as the Allies found a way to detect one ink, the Germans would develop a new one. Beyond ink, there was another, even more amazing steganographic tool, the microdot. The Germans perfected this technique. They would photograph a full page of text and then, through a special photographic process, shrink it down to the size of a pinhead. This tiny dot could then be hidden on an ordinary letter, perhaps as the period at the end of a sentence. The recipient would need a microscope to read the message. The head of the American Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, called the microdot the enemy's masterpiece of espionage. Finding these tiny dots was an incredible challenge for Allied counterintelligence. It required painstaking examination of every single document. So, what are the still unsolved puzzles of this hidden war? How many different formulas for secret ink were developed that were never detected by Allied censors? Were there other more exotic forms of steganography, like hiding messages in the musical notes of a song or the knitting pattern of a sweater? What was the single most important piece of intelligence successfully transmitted via invisible ink or microdot during the entire conflict? Number 10 was the British answer to Enigma, just a modified typewriter. The British knew they needed their own high-level cipher machine. While their codebreakers at Bletchley Park were working to break German codes, their own military needed a secure way to communicate. They had looked at the German commercial Enigma machine before the war and decided they could build something better. The result was the Typex. The Typex machine, at first glance, looked a bit like a clunky teleprinter. It had a keyboard for typing the message, and it would print the encrypted output onto a paper tape. Internally, it was a rotor cipher machine like Enigma, but it had, several key improvements that made it much more secure. A standard Typex machine had 5 rotors, not 3, and unlike the Enigma, the rotors were not all wired the same way. There were different types of rotors that could be placed in any order, increasing the number of possible setups. One of the most important improvements was the inclusion of 2 stator rotors on either side of the main 5. These were stationary and added another layer of scrambling. But the biggest advantage of Typex over the German military Enigma was its ability to print. An Enigma machine required 2 operators, one to type the message and another to write down the letters as they lit up on the lampboard. This was slow and could lead to errors. The Typex operator could simply type the message and the machine would print out the ciphertext, or vice versa. This made it much faster and more accurate. The Typex was developed in the 1930s by Wing Commander O.G.W.G. Lywood and the Creedon Company. It became the standard high-grade cipher for the British Armed Forces and was also used by Commonwealth countries like Canada and Australia. It was a workhorse machine used at all levels of command. A special version was even developed that could be attached directly to teleprinters, allowing for secure, long-distance teletype communications. The security of the Typex was excellent for its time. A critical feature was that the rotors could be wired in many different ways. The British had special workshops where they could change the internal wiring of the rotors, something the Germans did not do with Enigma. This meant that even if the enemy captured a Typex machine, they would still have a hard time breaking the messages without knowing the specific wiring of the rotors being used on that day. Because of its security and adaptability, the Typex system was used to create the Combined Cipher Machine CCM, which allowed the British and American forces to communicate securely using their Typex and SIGABA machines, which were made to be interoperable. But there are still things we don't know. Were there any serious security flaws discovered in the Typex during the war that were kept secret and patched? Did Axis cryptanalysts ever manage to break into low-level Typex traffic, even for a short period? How many different rotor wiring patterns were created and used throughout the war? And how was the complex logistics of distributing these rotors managed across a global military force? Number 9. Could you read a spy's message with a radio and a pencil? The one-time pad is, in theory, a perfect cipher. It is the only cryptographic system that has been mathematically proven to be unbreakable, provided it is used correctly. The principle is simple. The key is a random string of letters or numbers that is the same length as the message. The key is used only once and then destroyed. To encrypt, you combine the key with the plaintext. To decrypt, the recipient, who has an identical copy of the key, reverses the process. Because the key is truly random and never reused, there are no patterns for cryptanalysts to find. During the Second World War, one-time pads were used for the most sensitive communications. Spies operating behind enemy lines, intelligence agencies, and high-level diplomatic channels all relied on them. The Soviet Union was a particularly heavy user of one-time pads for its intelligence networks. Messages sent using this system were often transmitted by clandestine radio operators using Morse code. The messages themselves sounded like gibberish, just long strings of random letters or numbers. To an enemy listening post, there was nothing to analyze. The challenge of a one-time pad system is not the cryptography itself, but the logistics. You need to produce and securely distribute the pads. The pads were often printed as tiny booklets of numbers or letters, small enough to be concealed. An agent might be given a set of pads that would last for several months. Each page was a key for a single message. After a page was used, it was to be destroyed, often by burning. The British Special Operations Executive SOE also used one-time pads. Their agents were trained in how to use them. The encryption process was done by hand. For a letter-based pad, an agent would typically use a system called a Vigenère square, a grid of the alphabet. They would find a plaintext letter at the top of the grid and a key letter on the side, and the encrypted letter would be where the row and column intersected. It was a slow, meticulous process. A single mistake could make the entire message unreadable. The unbreakable nature of the one-time pad depends on 4 critical rules. The key must be truly random. It must be at least as long as the message. It must be kept completely secret. And most importantly, it must never ever be used more than once. The moment a key is reused, it creates a vulnerability. If an enemy has two messages encrypted with the same key, they can use statistical methods to start teasing the messages apart. This very mistake would later lead to the partial cracking of some Soviet communications in the post-war Venona project, but during the war, the discipline was generally very high. What mysteries still surround the use of one-time pads? How many agents were caught and compromised because their one-time pads were discovered? What creative methods were used to disguise and smuggle the physical pads into enemy territory? Did any intelligence agency ever try to deliberately introduce flawed, non-random pads to an opponent's system as a form of cryptographic sabotage? Number 8. What if a code was based on a common book? A book cipher is one of the oldest types of ciphers in history. The idea is simple and clever. Two people agree to use the same book as their key. It has to be the exact same edition of the book. To encrypt a message, you find the word you want to send in the book and replace it with a set of numbers indicating its location, for example, the page number, the line number, and the word number on that line. So, the word attack might be encrypted as 112 to 14.8, meaning page 112, line 14, word 8. This method has some real advantages for spies or irregular forces. There's no need to carry around a suspicious code book. A common novel, a dictionary, or even a Bible would not attract any attention. It's a system that is low-tech and easy to understand. During the Second World War, book ciphers were sometimes used by spies and resistance groups for this very reason. It was a practical, if not perfect, form of field cryptography. However, the book cipher has significant weaknesses. It's very slow and laborious to use. Finding each word in a book to encrypt a message takes a long time. It can also be insecure. If an enemy cryptanalyst suspects a book cipher is being used, they can start testing common books. The Bible was a popular choice, as were works by Shakespeare or popular novels of the day. If the same word appears multiple times in the message and it's encrypted with different number groups, that's a clue that it's a book cipher. There was also a more sophisticated version called a running key cipher, where a passage from a book is used as a long key, similar to a one-time pad. The letters of the book passage are added to the letters of the plaintext message to create the ciphertext. This is more secure than the word finding method, but it is vulnerable if the enemy can guess the book being used. Interesting variation of this concept was used not for secrecy, but for training. At Bletchley Park, new recruits were sometimes given a series of messages to break. These messages were often encrypted using a mock cipher system based on a book that everyone had access to, like a London telephone directory or a railway timetable. This was a way to teach them the principles of cryptanalysis, looking for patterns, making logical deductions, and thinking creatively without using real classified enemy traffic. It was a training ground for the minds that would go on to break the most complex codes of the war. Many questions about book ciphers remain unanswered. What was the most unusual book ever used as a key that we know of? Are there any verified cases of a book cipher being broken during the war, leading to the capture of a spy or the failure of a mission? Did any groups try to use more obscure documents like engineering manuals or seed catalogs to make their ciphers harder to break? Number 7. How could a deck of cards send a secret message? The Slidex was a British cipher system that was beautifully simple and effective for its time. It was a small, pocket-sized device. It consisted of a cardboard or bakelite sleeve with a sliding insert. On the sleeve and the slide were alphabets printed in a jumbled random order. The system was designed for low-level tactical communications, the kind of messages that needed to be secure for a few hours, but not for days. The way Slidex worked was based on a simple substitution cipher, but with a constantly changing key. The operator would slide the inner card to a new position for each letter of the message. The daily key sheet would tell the operator what the starting arrangement of the alphabets was and what the check letters were for that day. To encrypt the letter A, for example, the operator would look at the plaintext alphabet on one part of the device and find the A. They would then look at the ciphertext alphabet on another part of the device to find the corresponding encrypted letter. Then, they would slide the card to a new position based on a prearranged sequence before encrypting the next letter. This process of changing the alignment for each letter is what made SlideX more secure than a simple substitution cipher. In a simple substitution, E always becomes, for example, Q. In SlideX, E could become Q for the first letter, but % for the fifth, and Q for the 10th. It was a type of polyalphabetic cipher, but one that could be implemented with a very simple, cheap, and portable device. It was fast and easy to use in the field, which was crucial for soldiers in a trench or pilots in a cockpit. SlideX was used extensively by the British Army and the Royal Air Force during the war. It was never intended to be a high-security system like Typex. It was vulnerable to certain types of cryptanalytic attack if a large amount of traffic was intercepted. A skilled codebreaker could potentially spot patterns and work out the underlying alphabets, but for its intended purpose, protecting tactical information for a short period, it was very successful. The enemy would have had to intercept the messages, solve the cipher, and get the information to their field commanders all before the information was no longer useful. In most cases, this was simply not possible. There are still many details about SlideX that are not widely known. How many different alphabet arrangements were produced and distributed for the SlideX system throughout the war? Were there any known instances of a SlideX device being captured and immediately used by the enemy to decrypt tactical messages in real time? Did operators in the field develop their own unofficial protocols or tricks for using SlideX to try and improve its security beyond the official instructions? Number 6. Could you tap out a secret through a prison wall? The tap code is one of the simplest and most desperate forms of communication. It was not a code used by armies or navies, but by prisoners of war. It required no equipment, only knowledge and patience. The code is based on a 5x5 grid known as a Polybius square. The alphabet is laid out in the grid, with K often being omitted and represented by key. To send a letter, a prisoner would tap out 2 numbers. The first number was the row of the letter, and the second was the column. For example, to send the letter A, which is in the first row and first column, you would tap once, pause, and then tap once again 1, 1. For the letter H, row 2, column 3, you would tap twice, pause, and then tap 3 times 2, 3. To spell out the word water, you would send 522 for W, 11 for A, 44 for T, 15 for E, 422 for R. This system was famously used by American prisoners of war in camps in Southeast Asia during a later conflict, but its principles were also known and used by prisoners during the Second World War. It was a lifeline. Prisoners could use it to share information between cells, to keep morale up, and to organize. They could tap on walls, pipes, or even the floor. The sound was quiet and could often go unnoticed by guards. It was a slow and tedious way to communicate. A short sentence could take many minutes to tap out, but it was a link to another human being, a way to fight back against isolation. The code was not secure in a cryptographic sense. If a guard knew the system, they could understand the message. Its security came from its secrecy and its subtlety. The tapping could be disguised as random noise. And often, prisoners from different countries would be held together, so the messages might be in a language the guards didn't understand, adding another layer of obscurity. The story of the tap code is a story of human ingenuity under the most extreme pressure. It shows that the need to communicate is a fundamental human drive. These prisoners, with nothing but the walls around them and the time on their hands, created a secret, invisible network. They used a simple grid of letters to maintain their humanity and their will to survive. It was a code born not in a laboratory, but in the silence of a prison cell. What stories of the tap code have been lost to history? How did new prisoners learn the code from their neighbors without being able to speak to them directly? Were there different versions or dialects of the tap code used in different prisoner of war camps across Europe and Asia? What was the most critical piece of information ever communicated through the walls of a prison using this simple method? Number 5. Could a founding father's invention still be useful 150 years later? The M94 was a cipher device used by the U.S. Army. It was a mechanical device, but a very simple one. It consisted of 25 aluminum discs, each with a different scrambled alphabet printed on its edge, all threaded onto a central rod. It was a portable, tactical-level cipher system. What's fascinating about it is that its design was based on an invention from the 1790s by Thomas Jefferson, who called it the wheel cipher. The principle was straightforward. To encrypt a message, the operator would rotate each of the 25 disks until the first 25 letters of the plaintext message were lined up and readable across one row. Then, they would look at any of the other 25 rows on the cylinder and choose one at random to be the ciphertext. The recipient, who had an identical M94 with the disks in the same order, would line up the ciphertext letters on their device. They would then look around the cylinder until they found the one row that made a coherent English message. The U.S. Army adopted this system developed by Major Joseph Malbornier in 1922. It remained the standard tactical cipher for the Army for 2 decades. It was used in the early parts of the Second World War. The M94 was a good example of a polyalphabetic cipher. Each letter of the plaintext was encrypted using a different cipher alphabet, determined by the scrambled letters on each disk. This made it much stronger than simple substitution ciphers. However, the M94 had its flaws. If a cryptanalyst could get a large amount of ciphertext, they could start to look for statistical patterns that might give away the underlying alphabets on the disks. Also, if the plaintext message contained common words or phrases, it could create what's called a probable word attack. If an analyst suspected the message contained the word division, for example, they could look for ciphertext that could produce that word on a hypothetical M94. By 1943, the M94 was considered no longer secure enough for the modern battlefield. It was replaced by more sophisticated systems like the M209, a small mechanical rotor machine. But for many years, this simple device, based on a design from the 18th century, was the primary way the U.S. Army protected its secrets on the move. It's a reminder that good cryptographic ideas can have a very long life. What do we still not know about the M94's service? Were there any documented cases of an enemy cryptanalyst successfully breaking M94 messages during the early years of the war? How were the secret orders of the 25 disks distributed to units in the field, and how often were they changed? Did Thomas Jefferson ever imagine that his wheel cipher would one day be used in a global mechanized conflict? Number 4. Did a Swedish inventor's machine encrypt secrets for both sides? The C-series of cipher machines were created by a Swedish inventor named Boris Hagelin. These were small, portable, mechanical cipher machines that were purely mechanical, requiring no electricity. They were rugged, reliable, and relatively cheap to produce. Because Sweden was a neutral country, Hagelin was able to sell his machines to many different nations before and during the war. The most famous of these was the C-38, which was adapted by the U.S. military and mass-produced as the M209. The M209 was used extensively by the U.S. Army for tactical communications. It was a compact box, about the size of a lunchbox, with a dial for selecting letters, a set of 6 key wheels or pins, and a small printer that would output the ciphertext on a paper strip. The cryptographic method of the M209 was based on a series of 6 pinwheels, with varying numbers of pins on them. The operator would set the pins on each wheel to an active or inactive position based on the daily key. As a letter was encrypted, these wheels would rotate. The interaction of the active pins on the wheels would cause a lug on a squirrel cage to shift, which in turn would shift the ciphertext alphabet. This created a long, complex, and seemingly random key sequence that was added to the plaintext. It was a brilliant piece of mechanical engineering. The M209 was considered a mid-grade cipher. It was much more secure than pencil and paper ciphers, but not as secure as the high-level rotor machines like SIGABA or Typex. The German army had a special unit at their Signals Intelligence Agency that was dedicated to breaking M209 traffic. They had some success, particularly if the American operators made mistakes like, sending messages with a weak key setting or sending too many messages with the same key. The Americans, in turn, knew the system had vulnerabilities and issued frequent warnings and procedure changes to their operators to maintain security. The fascinating part is that Hagelin's company also sold machines to the other side. Italy and Japan used versions of the Hagelin machines. This created a strange situation where cryptanalysts on both sides were often working on breaking ciphers created by very similar technology. The security of the message depended less on the machine itself and more on the key settings and the discipline of the operators using it. Boris Hagelin's invention became a standard piece of equipment in a war where his own country remained on the sidelines. What are the untold stories of the Hagelin machines? How much did the German codebreakers' success against the M209 actually impact battles on the ground in places like North Africa and Italy? Did the US and its allies gain any advantage from the fact that they understood the inner workings of the Hagelin machines used by some of their opponents? What modifications, if any, did different countries make to the basic Hagelin design to create their own unique and supposedly more secure versions? Number 3, how could two simple grids make a message nearly unreadable? The double transposition cipher is a pencil and paper cipher that is surprisingly strong even by modern standards if done correctly. It was a favorite of intelligence agencies and resistance groups because it required no special equipment, just a pre-arranged keyword and a lot of patience. The German intelligence service and the Soviet spy networks were known to use it. The process is complex and requires great attention to detail. First, the sender writes the plaintext message into a grid. The width of the grid is determined by the length of a secret keyword. For example, if the keyword is secret 6 letters, the grid will be 6 columns wide. The message is written into the grid row by row. Next, the columns of the grid are rearranged. The order is determined by the alphabetical order of the letters in the keyword. In secret, the order would be C, E, E, R, S, T. So, the third column C comes first, then the second column E, then the fourth the second E, and so on. The message is then read out column by column in this new jumbled order. This is the first transposition. But the process isn't over. This newly scrambled message is then written into a second grid using a second keyword. The same process is repeated. The columns are rearranged based on the alphabetical order of the second keyword, and the message is read out again. The result is the final ciphertext. The letters are the same as the original message, but their order has been scrambled so thoroughly that it is incredibly difficult to put them back together without knowing the two keywords and the dimensions of the grids. Breaking a double transposition cipher is a massive headache for a cryptanalyst. Standard frequency analysis is useless because the letter frequencies are the same as normal text. The analyst has to try to figure out the size of the grid. They do this by looking for messages of the same length, which might have been encrypted using the same grid dimensions. Then they have to try to put the columns back in the right order, a process called anagramming. It's like trying to solve a giant complex Sudoku puzzle. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had a section known as the testery that worked on these types of ciphers. It was slow, intellectual work that relied more on linguistic skill and intuition than on machinery. What are the remaining secrets of this method? What was the longest and most important message ever sent using a double transposition cipher that was successfully decrypted by an enemy? Did any spy ever get caught because they made a simple counting or transcription error while performing the complex two-step process? How were the secret keywords for these ciphers chosen and communicated to agents in the field to prevent them from being compromised? Number 2, were the Germans reading the Allies' transatlantic mail? In the early part of the war, a significant amount of communication between the United States and Great Britain was sent via transatlantic telephone cable. To protect the conversations of high-level leaders like Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, a special encryption system was needed. This system was called Sigsaly. It was a massive and revolutionary piece of technology. Sigsaly was the first system to use digital voice encryption. When someone spoke into the special telephone, their voice was converted into a digital signal. This signal was then encrypted using a key that was a one-time pad. The key was a series of random numbers generated by the noise of a large vacuum tube. These random numbers were recorded onto large phonograph records. An identical set of records was made and securely transported to the other end of the line. During a call, the record at each end would be played in perfect synchronization with the other. The random numbers from the record were used to encrypt the digital voice signal. At the receiving end, the same random numbers were used to decrypt it, turning it back into audible speech. Because it used a one-time pad, Sigsaly was, in theory, completely unbreakable. A new random key was used for every single conversation. The Sigsaly terminals were huge. A single one filled a large room, weighed over 50 tons, and used thousands of vacuum tubes. They were installed in secure locations like the Pentagon in Washington and the basement of Selfridge's department store in London. The system went into operation in 1943. It provided a level of secure, real-time voice communication that had never existed before. It allowed the Allied leaders to talk to each other with the confidence that no one was listening in. The German government knew the Allies had a secure voice system. They had listening posts that could pick up the strange, hissing noise that Sigsaly produced when it was transmitted over the radio waves. They assigned teams of engineers and cryptanalysts to try and break it. They recorded hours and hours of the noise. But they never succeeded. They were trying to break a one-time pad system, and they had no way to get their hands on the key records. The secrets discussed over Sigsaly remained safe for the entire war. The technology developed for Sigsaly was groundbreaking and laid the foundation for modern digital communications and data encryption. But what parts of the Sigsaly story are still obscure? How were the massive and delicate phonograph records containing the one-time keys transported securely across the Atlantic, which was still a war zone? What was the most critical decision made during a conversation that was protected by the Sigsaly system? Were there any close calls or security breaches involving the personnel who operated and maintained these top-secret machines? Number 1. What if the most common code was no code at all? Perhaps the most overlooked secret communication method of the Second World War was the use of open code or plain language. In countless situations, especially at the tactical level, information was sent over the radio using ordinary speech. This was fast, direct, and required no special equipment, but it was also completely insecure. Anyone listening on the same frequency could understand it. To get around this, units developed their own slang, jargon, and informal codes. These were not official cipher systems. They were ad hoc systems developed by groups of soldiers, pilots, or sailors who worked together. A tank commander might say, "Let's have a tea party at grid 123," to mean he was going to open fire on that location. An artillery spotter might use code words for different types of shells. These codes were constantly changing. They were based on shared experiences, inside jokes, and the specific circumstances of the battlefield. This type of communication was a security nightmare for military commanders, but for the soldiers on the ground, it was often the most practical way to communicate. The official cipher systems could be slow and cumbersome to use in the heat of battle. A simple voice command could be given and understood in seconds. The security of this method relied on its temporary nature. The slang used by a platoon on Tuesday might be completely different by Friday. An enemy intelligence officer who learned the code for machine gun nest would find that information useless a week later when the same unit was using a different term. This method was particularly common in air combat. Fighter pilots used a wide range of slang to describe enemy aircraft maneuvers and situations. Terms like bogey for an unidentified aircraft or tally-ho for a visual sighting of the enemy were a form of open code. They were understood by all Allied pilots, but might momentarily confuse an enemy listener. The speed of air combat meant there was no time for formal encryption. The use of plain language codes highlights the constant tension in military communications between security and speed. While the cryptographers were working on unbreakable ciphers, the soldiers on the front lines were creating their own disposable, informal systems out of necessity. It was a form of folk cryptography born from the realities of combat. What are the great unknowns of this informal world of codes? How many local, unofficial slang codes were created by small units that were never written down and are now lost forever? Did any enemy intelligence units specialize in rapidly learning and exploiting the slang of specific Allied units on their front? Can we ever truly know how many lives were saved or lost because of a misunderstood or correctly interpreted piece of battlefield jargon?